we want to talk about premise 2 as well. And remember, premise 2 says different cultures disagree about morality, right? Different cultures have different moral principles. In order to examine that, we have to talk about the nature of disagreements. Because it seems like there are actually two different kinds of disagreements within the moral framework. There are disagreements over facts, and then there are disagreements over morality. A disagreement over facts is a disagreement over the nuts and bolts of the issue. Okay? A disagreement over, so the nuts and bolts of the issue are things like, when does life begin? What constitutes murder? Okay? Imagine I say, murder is always wrong. And somebody says to me, no, it's not. Murder could be okay, in the case of self-defense. And then I said, but when I say murder, I mean the intentional and malicious killing of an innocent person for no good reason. The intentional and malicious killing of an innocent person for no good reason. Under those circumstances, self-defense wouldn't be murder, right? So if somebody were going to disagree with me, saying that self-defense is okay, we would be having a disagreement over what constitutes murder. We would be having a disagreement over the fact about the definition of murder. But if that person says, yes, now I understand. If you define murder like that, the intentional and malicious killing of an innocent person for no good reason, you are correct. Murder is always wrong. We would no longer be having any kind of disagreement. But if the person said, okay, so murder is the intentional and malicious killing of an innocent person for no good reason. Okay, I buy. That doesn't include killing in self-defense. But I still think murder is not always wrong. I still think it might be the case that an instance of intentional and malicious killing of an innocent person for no good reason could be morally correct. Under those circumstances, we're having a disagreement over morality. Because we disagree over whether the action is right or wrong, even when all the facts have been settled. Okay? So the question becomes, all these disagreements that appear to be about morality in the world, are they really about morality or are they about facts? A disagreement over abortion might be a disagreement over when life begins or whether God says it's wrong. These are all disagreements over facts. Hindus believe that cows are sacred and that their relatives are reincarnated into cows, and so it's not okay to eat beef. Okay. Anybody here think it's okay to eat grandma? No. We tend to think that, we have disagreements over whether grandma's in the cow, right? It's not that, Hindus and non-Hindus disagree over whether it's permissible to eat grandma. We disagree over whether grandma's been reincarnated in the cow. It's a disagreement over facts, not a disagreement over morality. So, premise 2 claims that there are disagreements. Okay, premise 2 claims different cultures have different moral standards, okay? Premise 2 specifically read, people's moral judgments do differ from culture to culture. Well, the objection to premise 2, the reason why we might think premise 2 is false, is because maybe these disagreements are not over morality. They're over facts. Maybe the culture that thinks that girls at age 11 have to be circumcised, even if it's done by a broken piece of glass, is not a disagreement over morality. It's a disagreement over the question of whether women can be trusted to not engage in sex before they're married or sex outside of the marriage bond. That's the reasoning, girls have to be circumcised so that they will receive no enjoyment from sex, because if they did, they would sleep with anybody they could get a hold of. It's okay for the men to have sex outside of marriage, but not for women. This is a disagreement over facts, a disagreement over the equality of women, not a disagreement over morality. So for premise 2 to be true, people's moral judgments do differ from culture to culture. We would want to think that disagreement, that difference, was actually over morality. Because it might be that if we were to settle the facts, the disagreement would disappear. Does that make sense? So the cultural differences argument, premise 1 is not obviously true because that there's a disagreement does not entail that there's no answer. Well, premise 2 might be false as well because it seems like the moral judgments from culture to culture may not be disagreements over morality. They might be disagreements over facts. So we have these potentially unsavory consequences to cultural relativism. The argument for cultural relativism fails. This leads us to the question of whether we ought to be cultural relativists.